This feels like a unique time,
Yeah.
Senator Peters. You know, it's a lot at stake.
Oh, there is.
You know, I'm 34 years old. I've been able to vote a few times now, but I feel like there's not been a time where my vote matters as much as it does now.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about kind of what's at stake, not only in the presidential election, but what's at stake in the senator race.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we're in a time that none of us have ever experienced before in terms of being a health crisis and an economic crisis at the same time. I hope this is the only time we have it the rest of our life. You know, they always say this is once in a generation time in terms of the challenges we have, and I hope that's the case. But we really have so much at stake. One, we got to get through this pandemic, and what we've seen from the president, the lack of leadership, means that we're still here. We're still here in masks. We're still doing the social distancing after all of these months, and it was probably really, and I had a front seat to all of that as a ranking member. I'm the top Democrat on Senate Homeland Security Committee. One of our responsibilities, we oversee FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management folks, and it was clear from the outset that the president did not have a national plan and didn't take it seriously. And the one thing we know from a pandemic, and we knew it from 1918, the last big one here in the country, but if you let a virus get ahead of you, it's really hard to catch up to it. Mm-hmm. You know, a virus just expands exponentially. And once you get behind, you're always catch up, and then you aren't containing it. Have you really lean in right at the beginning, when there's just a few people that are sick? Then you can kind of contain it in a community. But once it gets out, it's tough. And so here we are. We're dealing with that, and now we're seeing a spike again. As all the scientists told us to be ready for the fall. It could come back as people go indoors. So our number one priority right now is get through the crisis, and we got to focus and have a national plan. And then and make sure businesses like your business, if a small business doesn't survive, any hope that we have to get the economy up and running quickly, it's not going to happen. You know, you're the job creator, you're the engine of growth here, and serving the community. And if you can't survive,
talk to me about Congress. Number one, educate me on how it all works. You know, briefly. You've got the House of Representatives, you've got the Senate. Help me understand you all's responsibility and how it affects somebody like myself, a small business owner.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the House of Representatives is 435 folks there. They represent districts all around their states. And so actually Detroit's kind of split in two, and two different members of Congress. And then the Senate, there are 100 of us, two per state. So I represent the entire state of Michigan, with Debbie Stabenow as my colleague. And then we're up for a 6-year term, and then we're up at different times. So about a third of the Senate every 2 years is up. And the Senate plays a different role. I mean, we also do the same thing that Congress does, pass bills, pass the funding for the government. But the president, all of the appointments the president puts forward has to go through advice and consent of the Senate. So the Supreme Court nominee that just came up, you know, she gets nominated by the president, but it's up to the Senate to confirm. And in a lot of ways, I think the Senate's even more important than the presidency. Everybody thinks about the president, which is incredibly important. But if you don't have friends in the Senate, if you don't have the majority with you, it can be very difficult to get things done. And we saw that with President Obama. President Obama comes in. He's got a lot of great ideas, a lot of initiatives. And then when it went to the Senate, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans would say, no, we aren't going to do anything to help the president. But to your question about a small business owner, we need to have small business relief. There was some in the CARES Act that we passed. And it passed bipartisan, but you need more. As you said, your business is still hurting. If we go into a second wave, it's going to be really tough again. It could be even tougher than what you saw in the past. Yeah. We need to provide resources to help you survive and keep people employed and keep your business going. The Democrats in the House passed the bill 5 months ago to provide you and other small business owners help. Yeah. The Republicans in the Senate have said no help. And instead of working to help you and your business, we've been spending the last month on this Supreme Court nominee, which is just not in touch with people on the ground, what people are going through.
And I think, and this question is to you, Akeem, and you, Ron, we've been experiencing the pandemic along with everyone else around the world. However, I think as black men and black women and black people, we've also been experiencing this epidemic in our country that is racism.
Yeah.
One, which one has been tougher for you all? And how have you been kind of getting through this? And what do you see at stake in this election? Not only the presidential election, but also, mentioning the Senate and their role in helping not only us as business owners and entrepreneurs and black people. Like, do you feel that you've been represented? Do you feel like this has been incredibly difficult for you? Like, what's your take on all this?
Sebastian, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said that this is the first time that I've ever been affected. Mm-hmm. My peace of mind has been affected. My everyday life, my everyday peace of mind has been affected by the decisions or indecisions that our government has made, right? And the thing about it is that, like, you're in a place in a constant where your fight or flight hormones are in a constant release, right? Where you have to always make the determination of whether it's a fear or danger, and you have to, you're battling that every day. Mm-hmm. And so what happens with that, it becomes a physiological change. Like, mm-hmm. your body chemistry starts to change because of that. If you're in a constant state of trying to figure out whether you're in fear or is there danger or there's misinformation, you're just confused by it. And part of it is when you continue to look at the response that, the administration is having, and you see and you just kind of shake your head, like, you just say, like, how do normal people that you respect, why do they continue to support that, right? Mm-hmm. And those things are just tough to kind of deal with on a daily basis,
Mm-hmm. So. What you, team?
I mean, I feel when it comes down to how the government has, treated African Americans or looked at African Americans' problems and tried to find solutions, I don't have much, honestly, I just don't have much hope there based on what's been done. Our group of folks tend to be looked upon last, if at all. And it really, to me, showed just how much when the pandemic hit. And it also showed me how, as a people, as a country, how folks can be so callous and lack any kind of empathy or humanity towards folks who are not able to stay at home, who are not able to, have access to the internet to work remotely or to continue to make a living, and have to go out here and be subjected to folks who will spit in their face or who will cough in their face or who will not wear masks, and they have no recourse. And the problem that I see has been exacerbated by, of course, the president and the folks that follow the president, which seems to get a lot of media attention as well. Yeah. And the fact that they're even still discounting that this is not real, that this is not something that exists, and this is more of a ploy by the nasty Democrats to or the left or whatever you call it, But the reality is people are dying. People in my community are dying. Family members have died. Friends have died. This is real. Yeah. This is real.
So let's talk about that. We've talked about empathy. We talked about reform. We talked about people, as you mentioned, following Trump and willing to go to our state's capital with automatic weapons. We're calling it a militia. A lot of them are racist, if we're being honest, and acting as if this pandemic isn't real, right? And we've already talked about living under the state of an epidemic that is racism as an infrastructure. How do we, or how do you, as a senator, help your colleagues or people across the aisle have that empathy? How do we reform, this justice system that's become kind of an injustice system for our community? How do we kind of reform these things and change this infrastructure? What does that actually look like?
Well, I think it takes a lot of forms, and it's complex, and we have to deal with all of them simultaneously, which is critically important. Part of it is changing attitudes, too. I think that was such an important point, too, with folks. And changing attitudes, obviously, is harder but to do. You can't do that legislatively, but you have to pass laws to kind of push that to happen. And you can lean into these issues to make sure that we're moving forward. And a couple comments that I think are incredibly important, too, that hit home with me is what we've seen in the pandemic. We've always known these problems exist, but now it's like everybody's face. I mean, it's really clear. When you saw what happened when the pandemic first hit this country, it was the African American community that was hit disproportionately. We saw that here in Michigan. 12% population African American, yet 40% of the deaths, primarily here in the city of Detroit, that were hit. And that's what happens, is that you always see when there's a natural disaster, it tends to disproportionately hit certain communities. We have to have that recognition and make sure we flood resources in to help folks. So that's one area where Sebastian and I'm working on, working with FEMA, the federal emergency folks, is that when this was hitting, and we were one of the first hotspots. It was New York, it was New Jersey, and it was here in Detroit, in southeast Michigan, but primarily Detroit. The FEMA didn't provide additional resources. They were spreading it around all over the country, but it wasn't like the whole country was hurting at that time. We had to be prepared, yes, but if you don't have enough resources to go around, you focus on who's hurting the most. That's like hospital triage. Take care of the sickest patients that you can save first before you deal with the less sick patients, or if you're in a war zone, in a military hospital. That's kind of what we had to do. And it showed that we had to change those attitudes. Folks, I don't think appreciated that. So I've got legislation that's already passed out of committee to create a unit within FEMA of civil rights and community inclusion, so that when we really know whether it's a hurricane or a flood or a wildfire or COVID, that some communities are going to get hit harder, and they tend to be communities of color. We've seen it in the past. We saw it in the hurricane in New Orleans and other places where that's happened, and yet we haven't made those changes. I'm working to make that change so that we can deal with that issue, which is critically important. And that also means resources, not just during the pandemic, but understand it's health disparities. We have to make sure everybody has quality, affordable health care, which is why on the ballot this year is the Affordable Care Act. President Obama's signature accomplishment is on the ballot. We've got Republicans and this new Supreme Court nominee who basically says we're going to declare it unconstitutional. It's going to go away. That's going to hit folks in the city of Detroit in a major way. When you think about hundreds of thousands of people in the city now have health care because of President Obama and the Affordable Care Act. And the Republicans are going to take that away. So those disparate impact on communities we have to address. You mentioned police reform too. Police reform is an issue that we should stop talking about and just take action. We keep talking about it and talking about it. We don't need to talk about the banning of chokeholds. That they just don't have a place in police. We should ban it. So the House passed that. What did the Republicans do in the Senate? Well, let's do a further study. There's no reason to have a further study on that. We also need to do things like to maintain trust in the community, that if a police officer is accused of wrongdoing, there needs to be an independent investigation outside of the department that looks at that individual. We don't need to talk about that anymore. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty clear, and a community, if they see that happening and it stays in the department, then it looks like it's the good old boy network again, just protecting their own, and then you lose trust in the community. And if you lose trust in the community, you have as Ron mentioned, the fear and other ideas because you just don't trust. A democracy doesn't survive without trust. So how do we make sure we're building trust in all of our communities to do that? And having an independent investigation, a fresh set of eyes, will bring credibility to that. So it's those kinds of meaningful things that we have to do now. Stop talking about it. But I'll go back to elections. If you don't have a Democratic majority in the United States Senate, if I don't get reelected and we pick up a few states, the good news is we think we can pick up a few. If you don't get that happening, you're going to constantly get this stalemate and nothing's going to happen. And then people get more frustrated because nothing happens. And then that frustration builds and builds, and you start undermining the trust of the whole country. And that's really dangerous for this democratic republic that we have.
How do we change things? Because the things that have been done now, they're done. But how do we make sure we're changing things to be more equitable for the future of people that look like us, to make sure that when these crises happen again, 100 years from now, hopefully not, but they may, how do we make sure that we're doing things now, whether it's changing attitudes or putting laws in place, helping make sure that entrepreneurs look like me have three things: capital, right, connections, right, and cash flow.
Right.
How do we do these types of things, right, through legislation to make sure we prevent the underlying conditions and disparities in the future?
Yeah,
Because what's done is done.
right, right.
But how do we change it going forward?
You're absolutely right. You got to learn. You got to say, okay, this is what happened, and don't just forget about it once you get out of the crisis. Then everybody forgets and goes on business as usual. You can't do that. You got to learn and take action now. Your point about small business and capital to me is critical, and I'm working on legislation with that because we saw it. We knew it was out there. This is not something new, but with the pandemic, everything just had a bright light because then you really saw the divisions that existed and the problems. And so when we passed the Paycheck Protection Program for help small businesses, for example, when that first money went out, it went to primarily larger businesses that weren't really hurt that much because, they worked with the bank more, and so they were able to get at the front of the line. But you saw particularly businesses in communities of color and in rural communities. They were both underserved. You lived in a rural area, or if you're in a community of color, those businesses didn't get money, or didn't get the money they certainly deserve. And we know if a business, as we talked about earlier, if a business in this community goes under, it takes a whole lot more time for a new one to come in. So it has a long-term impact on it. And so in the second tranche, I pushed aggressively to carve out money to make sure it went to minority depository institutions that serve businesses in that community, community development, CDFIs, funds, smaller credit unions, and local banks that are in our local community, to make sure that you and other business owners could have access to capital. But then we found out, we knew, but saw it really aggressive or very clearly, that if a minority depository institution didn't have a lot of savings in the account, then they didn't have the leverage to make loans. So you got to inject capital into these institutions. So actually, I have a Community Investment Act that I've introduced that would have the Department of Treasury. It would be a no-interest loan put into that local bank, that minority depository institution bank. No interest, they can pay it back after years, but then that counts as deposits, and then they can leverage that out and lend money. So you'll see a cash infusion come into businesses like the one we're in right here. So that has to change. Then once that happens, and you empower entrepreneurs like you, Sebastian, then a community grows and thrives. But if you don't have access to capital like other people have, then that's never going to happen. And so we got to understand where those shortages are.
So, Ateem, you mentioned, you have family, you have friends that have died. You mentioned this is the first time you've really seen, something like this affect you, right? Yeah. What's at stake for you all in this election? Like, what do you want to see change going forward? How can, your elected officials help make that future a reality?
When you talk about some of the things that you want to see, those things that build wealth within our communities, right? Historically, there have been access to home ownership.
Right.
When you look at historically in the 1950s and 60s, we just got access to that.
Yeah, 64, 68.
68,
yeah.
Right? So, you look at that as being, something that we really need to focus on, is that home ownership, that access to equity, right? I bought a house a couple of years ago, and there's $60,000 in equity that's there that I could tap into to go invest and go do different things. Mm-hmm. Those are the type of things that we really need to start to focus on to be able to build wealth, through programs like education and home ownership and access to those things. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting? I read a stat that talked about, in 33 when, this mortgage, was created, and people that didn't look like us, white people were able to start to create wealth through home ownership. And we weren't. We were redlined, right? And in 68, when we were finally able to kind of buy a house, you know, people started buying homes and getting mortgages and things like that. Today, in 2020, there's less black home ownership than there was in 68. That was an alarming stat to me. And when you talk about wealth creation and our lives being valued more
Yeah.
because of the equity and the wealth that we have, or the lack thereof, you know, I think that's a concrete thing that we can look at changing.
And you know what, Sebastian, too, while you said that, you think about the home ownership as being a cornerstone of
Wealth creation.
wealth creation, right? And you also think about the concentration of taxes that you pay on your home in certain communities, right? And how that affects if you got pockets of areas where homes are just, you know, you got blight and, you know, certain areas, and it drives home ownership down, and it drives the tax basis for those local communities and things like trash collection, you know, things like, you know, just basic city services and cutting grass and the aesthetic views of the neighborhoods. And that also plays a key into it. So it's kind of like it continues to build. It's a snowball effect at the cornerstone of what home ownership is, and credit and understanding and things of that nature. So you just made a good point and made me think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, just one last thing with the real estate piece, which is very important, and it's also important to realize and understand going forward. You have to, you know how to use that, that process for your benefit. Like you were saying, you have equity in your house. You can pull out equity to invest in certain things so that you can continue to grow your wealth. But a lot of folks are not taught that. In our community, we're not taught that, and a lot of folks are buying houses with adjustable rate. The predatory lending is a big issue. I mean, with the market crash back in 2008 or whatever. I mean, that's what that was all about. And so these are things. It's not just home ownership. It's actually about understanding and educating, and then being able to use that to your benefit for your community.
When you talk about creating wealth, owning where you live is incredibly important. Owning where you work is also important. But you can't do any of that if you're not healthy, right? Your opponent is against Obamacare. Is that correct?
He wants it repealed.
Right? And, just talk about the kind of difference in your opinion on that versus his opinion on that, and, what could happen if that is repealed. What does that look like?
It looks really bad, really bad. When you look at what the system was before we had the Affordable Care Act and the changes, and we need to build. We need to build from the Affordable Care Act to make it even stronger. But getting rid of it is not the answer. And as you said, my opponent thinks it should be repealed, as the Republicans do, and he supports Trump 2,000%. And Trump's actually has a lawsuit right now to throw out the Affordable Care Act to make it unconstitutional. In fact, this new nominee that they just pushed through, we're pretty clear that she's going to vote to do that. And that case comes up just a week after the election. So a week after the election, they could decide to throw it out, and the ramifications to folks here in the city and across the state. One of the biggest things is that under the Affordable Care Act, if you have a pre-existing condition, you have protections that you still can get affordable health care. Before, if you had a pre-existing condition, the insurance company will say, well, I'll sell you a policy, but it'll be $20,000 a month or whatever it is. It's not affordable. It's not, you can't afford it. And what do you do without insurance? So now they have to provide it. It's part of a very elaborate system to make sure that it's affordable. Republicans just want to pull it out, and they have no plan. No plan how to replace it. So that's catastrophic. And they've had 10 years since we passed the Affordable Care Act with President Obama, and they still have no plan. My opponent has no plan. When he was recently asked, he was just staring a blank stare, and then had the kind of talking points that Republicans have been saying for 10 years. So you got pre-existing conditions, and we're in a pandemic with, if you have COVID and you survive it, hopefully, you now have a pre-existing condition, because we think there's a lot of impact to your body in the years ahead. And then if you look at other aspects of it, Medicaid expansion that allowed 800,000 people in the state of Michigan that have health care coverage now, that would be pulled out from them. 800,000, massive number. Things like prescription drugs for senior citizens. There was a donut hole when you pay for prescription drugs, and then all of a sudden the price went way up. The Affordable Care Act got rid of that. And you think of seniors who literally live from check to check and have to make a decision between prescription drugs and food. To have that up, it will be catastrophic to them. The other aspect of the Affordable Care Act that's really important is that we eliminated the caps that insurance companies would place on your health insurance. They used to have a cap. We will spend this amount of money. After that, you're on your own. And so if you get really sick, you can have huge bills when you come out of the hospital. But under the bad old days with the cap, you would be responsible for them, and then there's no way you could afford it. And talk about wealth. Yeah. Before the Affordable Care Act, the number one reason for people filing personal bankruptcy was they got sick. And they came out of the hospital and they didn't have money. Then they were wiped out. You're just wiped out. That should not happen in this country. So the Affordable Care Act says no caps. If you go into the hospital, the insurance company's got to pay until you get out healthy. That's just part of it. All that goes away. And so literally healthcare is on the ballot. We got to be very clear. Healthcare is on the ballot in a few days. And if the Supreme Court does what we think they will to throw it out, you better make sure you elect people who are going to put in a new system immediately. We'll tweak whatever we have to and have the Affordable Care Act. I was proud to be there when we passed it with President Obama. That's why I have his strong endorsement for my reelection, because we battled right alongside with each other. But you better have folks who have a plan, and that's where we as Democrats, we have the plan. It's working. There's no reason that it should be pulled out. And once again, I keep repeating this because I just think this is just so crazy. How could anyone in their right mind want to get rid of comprehensive health care in the middle of a pandemic? It makes no sense.
Yeah. George Floyd. We watched George Floyd be murdered over 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Right.
Okay. First of all, define what the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is, for those of us that might not know, and then what's your position on it versus your opponent's position on it.
I talked about a little bit earlier about concrete action, that we need to take action right now. And what passed through the House, the George Floyd Act, was concrete action. So it was the ban of chokeholds. There wasn't any more studies. Ban chokeholds. Independent investigations, no more studies. Pull that out. Make sure, for another example would be, make sure that if a police officer did engage in bad behavior and was sanctioned, that is on their record, so they just don't go to another police department somewhere else and do it again. You know, there has to be full transparency. We don't need to talk about that anymore. If someone engaged in inappropriate behavior in the police department here and they're fired, we don't want them to go somewhere in another community and do the same thing all over again. It makes no sense. You know, and you know, most police officers are professionals and they're great, but the bad apples, we have to make sure the bad apples don't stay in the system, because you're going to have more instances like that if you're prone to do it again. So the answer to the question is, if there were no more studies, it was actual action. The Republicans put forward another bill that was more studies, so I did not support that. In fact, I've had discussions with Wendell Anthony. The NAACP was opposed to the Republican version. National Action League, the Urban League groups, because they said you can't. We have to have action, and you can't start with a bar way down here. If we're going to negotiate a House version and a Senate version, because we come together, don't start with a bar really low. Vote for a bar that's up, so that we can really have something meaningful. So it was clear in my mind that the Republicans wanted to say they were doing something, but in reality, we're doing nothing. And we don't have time for that anymore.
When I saw that video with George Floyd, the blatant disregard for that African American life was put on full display, right?
Yeah.
I've seen it before. We've all seen it before. But for some reason, for that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, it really, broke through to a lot more folks that typically look the other way.
Yeah.
And these folks, the thing that is giving me hope now, because again, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see it, and it's heartbreaking for it to continue. And it has continued. But the thing that's giving me hope is the fact that, white people now are no longer looking the other way. They're right there with them, and they're saying the same thing now. Enough is enough.
Yeah.
This is too much. Enough. And they're standing there next to us. And I think that is going to be what's going to push it forward and make folks pay more attention to it. I mean, this is a global phenomenon now. It's not just America. We're not the only ones going through this, and now we know this. It's all over the world.
how would you encourage us to stay engaged and the generation to follow to stay engaged, having seen, you know, what we've seen, you know, this administration? It is disheartening. It seems like when we kind of take 2 steps forward, we take 1 step back or 5 steps back, right? We look at Reconstruction, you know, right after that was Jim Crow, right after Obama, we get Trump, you know. After we get Biden and Kamala and get you back in, what are we looking at after that?
Right.
But how do we stay engaged, and what's your kind of parting advice on this process and getting out there on November 3rd, if they haven't already?
Yeah, I just say that this is the time more than ever to be engaged, because we are at that pivotal point. And when you think about what has happened these last few years with the Trump administration, he has pushed the politics of hate and division, and dividing people and seeking power by dividing folks. We have always known through American history, we've had a lot of really tough times as a country, horrible times, but we usually get through them, and we usually get through them because we come together at some point. We come together and get through. You have now leadership that is trying to drive even wider wedges, which is incumbent then for all of us. We all have to do our part. If we're not doing it each individually and locking arms together, this dark side will continue to get worse. You talked about leading by example. I mean, you see the kind of hate out there, and I just think of the horrible plot against our governor, where we had this group that was going to kidnap her and eventually murder after a sham trial. And then you have a president who, instead of just sticking with or saying, we should celebrate the FBI and the state police for undermining this plot and doing it, what does he do? He launches into attacks on the governor again. It's like kind of feeding more of that division. We can't have leadership like that. You got to have leadership of folks who bring people together. But that just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen automatically. In this system, it's people who go out and vote that make that happen. You've got to get out and say your voice. So, I'm really hopeful in this election that obviously we win, but I think it's more important than just winning. What's really important is to win overwhelmingly. Because we have to come together as a country and say we soundly reject what we have seen these last few years of division and hatred, and the fact that we have to come together and find common ground. There hasn't been a willingness from the president to find any kind of common ground. I'm a guy that always looks for common ground. I'm a Democrat. I'm proud of it, but I reach across the aisle as much as I can. And to give you an example, I'm a freshman. I'm a new guy there, and so in the Senate, what we do is pass legislation to make changes. Is really what we do every day. So I'm a freshman, I'm junior, and I'm in a place where seniority matters. The longer you're there, the more power you get, or the more ability to get things done. And I'm in the minority party. I'm a Democrat, and the Republicans have the majority. But over the last 2 years, I have written and passed more bills through the United States Senate than any other Democratic senator or any other Republican senator. And the reason is because I do reach across the aisle, especially in the minority, and find common ground. Now, there are things I'm not going to agree with Republicans. There's clear divisions, as we saw. But we still have to govern. We still have to find common ground. And that's what we have to do going forward. That's why I'm running again, because I really believe that the risk to this great country of ours and this democracy is if we start having these kinds of divisions. It's pretty unique what we have in this country. And it's more fragile than I think people realize. And it can fall apart. And the only way a democracy survives is when all of us collectively stand up and say, enough is enough. We have to take action. We're going to have to exercise the main power we have in a democracy, which is our power to vote. And then we're going to hold folks accountable once we vote them in. But it's incumbent on all of us to do it. And it's fragile, and it can disappear quickly. And once it disappears, it's really hard to bring back. So we can't let it slide. We got to catch it right now, and we got to push it forward and understand we got to bring people together. And that's all on the ballot in just a few days.